Welcome to Hauntales, where darkest stories come alive. I know many of you tune into these tales to drift off to sleep, so settle in, relax, and get comfortable. Whether you're lying in bed or curled up on the couch, let the whispers of these chilling encounters carry you away. Before we begin tonight's story, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more spine-tingling tales, and let me know in the comments where are you listening from, and what time is it. I love seeing how far our stories travel. For the best experience, use your headphones, close your eyes, and let every word sink deep into your mind. Now we begin our stories for tonight. The Forgotten Graveyard. I never believed in curses, omens, or the supernatural. They always seemed like old wives' tales, stories to scare kids or gullible tourists. I prided myself on being a skeptic, a man of logic and reason, but that was before I found the graveyard. That was before I discovered the truth. Now I can't sleep. I can't think. I can't even walk down the street without feeling like something is following me, creeping just out of sight. You see, I know how I'm going to die. It all began on a hot summer day in late July. My friends and I had decided to go camping. Nothing special, just a weekend trip to clear our heads and get out of the city. It was supposed to be me, Luke, Jenny, and Claire, a small, close-knit group that had stuck together since college. We'd camped together many times before, and it always ended in drinking around the campfire, laughing and sharing spooky stories late into the night. But this trip was different. We had chosen a more remote location this time, far from the usual campgrounds. Luke had heard about it from someone at work, a place nestled deep in the forests of Vermont, well off the beaten path. It wasn't marked on any map, and that was part of its appeal. A hidden gem, or so we thought. We arrived in the late afternoon, our car bouncing over uneven dirt roads, dust rising up in clouds behind us. The forest was thick, the trees towering overhead, their branches knitting together to block out most of the sunlight. The deeper we drove, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as though the very air around us was pressing down, making it harder to breathe. But we pushed it aside, chalking it up to our excitement for the adventure. When we finally stopped, we found ourselves at the edge of a small clearing. The trees stood like silent sentinels around us, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. We set up camp quickly, each of us falling into familiar roles. Luke handled the fire, Jenny pitched the tents, Claire took charge of dinner, and I gathered firewood. As dusk settled in, an eerie quiet descended over the forest. The usual sounds of wildlife, birds chirping, insects buzzing were noticeably absent. It felt like the world was holding its breath. We sat around the fire, laughing and talking, but there was an undercurrent of unease that none of us could shake. The shadows cast by the flames seemed to move on their own, twisting and shifting unnaturally. By midnight, the mood had darkened further. Luke, always the instigator, suggested we explore the area. "Come on," he said, grinning. "Who knows what kind of creepy stuff we'll find out here?" Jenny and Claire hesitated, but eventually curiosity got the better of us. We grabbed our flashlights and set off into the woods, leaving the warmth and safety of the fire behind. The forest was pitch black, the trees looming over us like ancient giants. Every crack of a branch underfoot, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but something about the night felt wrong. And we walked for what felt like hours, the beam of my flashlight sweeping over the gnarled trunks of trees, the underbrush crunching beneath our boots. And then we saw it. A clearing opened up before us, much larger than the one where we had set up camp. At its center stood a small, dilapidated church, its wooden structure barely standing, as though a strong wind would knock it over. Surrounding the church was a graveyard, the headstones crooked and worn, some of them barely visible beneath the overgrown grass. "Weird place for a cemetery," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Luke, always the brave one, walked ahead, stepping over the rusted iron fence that encircled the graveyard. "Come on, guys," he called back. "It's just an old cemetery. Nothing to be scared of." Reluctantly, we followed. The air grew colder as we crossed the threshold into the graveyard, and a heavy silence fell over us. The only sound was the crunch of our footsteps on the gravel path. The headstones were old, the inscriptions barely legible. Most of the dates were from the 1800s, though some were even older. But what caught my eye was the layout. The graves weren't arranged in neat rows like in most cemeteries. They were scattered haphazardly, some facing the wrong direction, others sunken into the ground. It was unsettling, as though the dead had been buried without any thought or care. As we ventured deeper into the graveyard, something even stranger caught my attention. A particular row of gravestones seemed different. The names on these stones weren't weathered or eroded. In fact, they looked fresh, as though they had been placed recently. I bent down to inspect one and froze. The name on the gravestone was mine. Oh, I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the inscription. My name, my date of birth, and a blank space where the date of deaths. A cold chill ran down my spine. I turned to call the others, but my voice caught in my throat. Up behind me, Jenny, Luke, and Claire were standing in front of their own gravestones. What the hell is this? Claire's voice was shaky, her face pale. Is this some kind of sick joke? Luke ran his hand over the stone with his name, his expression unreadable. I don't get it. This can't be real. There's no way. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the graveyard, and all of our flashlights flickered and died, plunging us into complete darkness. The air around us grew even colder, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a chorus of whispers. I could feel someone watching us. "Let's get out of here," Jenny whispered urgently, grabbing my arm. But as we turned to leave, a figure appeared at the entrance of the graveyard. At first it was just a shadow, barely visible against the darkness. But as it moved closer, the outline became clearer. It was a woman dressed in a tattered white dress, her long, dark hair matted and hanging over her face. She moved unnaturally, her feet barely touching the ground as she glided toward us. None of us moved. None of us could. And the woman stopped a few feet away, her face still obscured by her hair. She raised one hand and pointed directly at me. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood frozen, unable to tear my eyes away from her. And then she spoke. "Leave," she rasped, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "Before it's too late." Her words echoed in my head, but my feet refused to move. The air around us seemed to thicken, pressing in from all sides. I felt a hand close around my wrist, Jenny's, pulling me back. "We have to go," she hissed, her voice trembling. "Now." "Mom." We turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind us, I could hear the woman's voice, still whispering, growing fainter as we fled. But no matter how far we ran, the sense of dread clung to me like a second skin. It wasn't just the woman's warning that haunted me. It was the gravestones, our gravestones, the blank spaces where the dates of our deaths, short deaths, should have been. By the time we made it back to camp, the fire had died down to embers, casting flickering shadows on the trees. We collapsed onto the ground, breathless and shaken. "What the hell just happened?" Claire demanded, her voice rising in panic. That was us back there. Our names, our graves. I don't know," Luke muttered, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, okay. Maybe it was a prank. Some sick local trying to scare off city folk." But I could see the fear in his eyes, the doubt creeping into his voice. He didn't believe his own words. None of us did. Gaunt. For the rest of the night, we huddled by the fire, too scared to sleep. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch sent our hearts racing. We kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting the woman to appear out of the darkness again, but she never did. The next morning, we packed up and left as quickly as we could. No one said a word on the drive back to town, but the tension in the car was palpable. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, convinced I would see someone following us. By the time we reached the outskirts of town, I tried to convince myself that it was over, that it had just been a strange, terrifying night, but nothing more. I was wrong. Greg. Chapter 2. The Haunting Begins. It's been 3 days since we left the graveyard. 3 days since we saw our names etched into those gravestones. At first, I thought I could shake it off that it was just a twisted prank or some kind of strange coincidence. But now I'm not so sure. The nightmares started the night we got back. I dreamed of the woman in white, her hollow eyes staring straight into my soul as she whispered my name over and over again. I could feel her breath on my skin, cold and damp like the chill of the grave. Every time I woke up, drenched in sweat, her voice echoed in my head, "Leave before it's too late." It's always the same, night after night. But it's not just the nightmares. The others are starting to feel it too. Claire was the first to mention it. 2 days after we returned, she called me in the middle of the night, her voice shaky and breathless. She'd been hearing things, she said, whispers in her apartment when she was alone, footsteps in the hallway that stopped right outside her bedroom door. And every time she went to check, there was no one there. "I'm not going crazy, right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Tell me this is all just in my head." I wanted to reassure her, tell her it was just a lingering fear from the graveyard. But the truth is, I was hearing things too. Faint voices in the middle of the night, the sound of someone or something scraping at my bedroom window. And that feeling, that overwhelming sense that I was being watched, followed me everywhere. The next day, Luke called. His voice was frantic, panicked. He hadn't been sleeping either. The nightmares were worse for him, more vivid. He described the woman in white in terrifying detail, the way her skin seemed to rot away, her hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. But there was something else too, something that chilled me to my core. "I saw my grave," Luke whispered, his voice barely audible. "In my dream I was standing in front of it, and the date of my death it was filled in. It was tomorrow." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I wanted to tell him it was just a nightmare, that it couldn't be real. But the fear in his voice was unmistakable. He believed it. And deep down, I was starting to believe it too. Chapter 3. The Descent into Fear. The following day, I went to Luke's apartment to check on him. His door was unlocked when I arrived, which immediately sent a jolt of unease through me. Or I pushed it open, calling his name, but the apartment was eerily silent. My footsteps echoed as I made my way down the hallway, and the tension in the air was so thick I could practically taste it. I found him sitting on the floor in his bedroom, staring blankly at the wall. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and there were deep shadows beneath them as though he hadn't slept in days. Empty beer cans and fast food containers littered the floor around him, and the air was stale with the scent of fear and desperation. "Luke," I called softly, but he didn't respond. I crouched beside him, shaking his shoulder gently. "Luke, come on, man. You're scaring me." Finally, he turned his head to look at me. "It's tonight," he whispered, his voice hollow and broken. "The date on the grave. It's today." I swallowed hard, trying to shake off the growing panic. "It was just a nightmare, Luke. We'll figure this out." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Something dark and insidious had wormed its way into our lives, and it wasn't going to let go so easily. Luke barely spoke the rest of the day, and by nightfall he had locked himself in his room, refusing to come out. I stayed with him, sleeping on the couch, just to make sure he wasn't alone. But when I woke up the next morning, I was greeted by a horrifying silence. I knocked on his door. No answer. I knocked harder. Still nothing. Panic rising, I threw open the door. And Luke was lying on his bed, motionless. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and his face was twisted in an expression of pure terror. His skin was cold to the touch, his body rigid. And there on his nightstand was a note scrawled in his messy handwriting. "She came for me." The police called it a heart attack, said the stress had been too much for him. But I knew better. I'd seen the terror in his eyes. I'd heard the woman's whispers in my dreams. Luke hadn't died of natural causes. He had been taken. Chapter 4. Jenny's Descent. After Luke's death, everything spiraled out of control. Jenny was next. She hadn't taken the news well, and I could see the fear eating away at her day by day. She stopped going to work, stopped leaving her apartment altogether. I tried to reach out, but she avoided me, too scared to talk about what was happening. And then, just like Luke, she called me one night, her voice frantic and breathless. I saw her, she whispered. She was standing at the foot of my bed, just watching me. I could hear the terror in her voice, the way it quivered. Jenny had never been one to scare easily, but now she was a shell of her former self. "She's coming for me next," she sobbed. "I don't know what to do. I can't sleep. I can't. I don't know how to stop it." I raced to her apartment that night, desperate to help her. But by the time I arrived, it was too late. I found her slumped in the corner of her bedroom, her hands clutching her chest, her eyes wide and lifeless. Just like Luke. And just like Luke, a note lay beside her. "The grave. It's calling me." The police again dismissed it as another heart attack, brought on by extreme stress. But I knew. Jenny hadn't just died. She had been claimed. Chapter 5. The final confrontation. By now, I was the only one left. Claire had vanished after Luke's funeral, her phone disconnected, her apartment abandoned. She had left without a trace, and I hadn't heard from her since. As for me, the nightmares had worsened. The woman in white was always there, lurking in the shadows of my dreams, watching, waiting. Every time I saw her, she was closer, her whispers louder, more urgent. "Your time is coming." I couldn't escape the feeling that my death was imminent, that it was only a matter of time before I joined Luke and Jenny. But I couldn't just sit back and wait for her to claim me. I had to do something, anything, to break the curse. I found myself drawn back to the graveyard. I knew it was insane, but something told me the answers lay there. That the woman in white wasn't just some ghost, she was something older, something darker. And she was tied to that place in a way I couldn't yet understand. I returned to the forgotten graveyard alone, my heart pounding in my chest as I made my way through the overgrown grass. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the sky above was a deep, unnatural shade of gray, as though the world itself was closing in on me. The graveyard was exactly as we had left it, silent, abandoned. But this time, something felt different. I could feel her presence, watching me from the shadows, waiting. I walked toward the church, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. And then I saw it. My gravestone. The inscription had changed. My name was still there, but now the date of my death was filled in. Today. A cold hand gripped my heart as I stared at the stone, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She was coming for me. But I wasn't going to let her. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I walked to the center of the graveyard, standing where I knew she could see me. I felt the cold wind pick up, swirling around me, and then she appeared. The woman in white. Her face was clearer now, no longer obscured by shadows. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes empty, hollow sockets that seemed to burn with an otherworldly light bore into mine. "You can't have me," I whispered, my voice trembling but defiant. "I won't let you." For a moment she stood there, her gaze unwavering. And then she smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was cruel, twisted. "I already have you," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "You've been mine since the moment you stepped into this graveyard." And then, with a sudden horrifying swiftness, she lunged at me. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, hooked up to machines, my body weak and frail. The doctors told me I had been found unconscious at the edge of the woods, barely alive. But I knew the truth. She had let me live for now. But the grave was still calling me. And one day I knew I would answer. Chapter 6. The Weight of the Grave. Weeks passed after I woke in the hospital, but the fog of dread never lifted. I tried to tell myself it was over, that the nightmare had ended the moment I was found in the woods. But the truth gnawed at me like a sickness, lurking beneath every rational thought. Luke, Jenny, and Claire gone, claimed by the woman in white, their fates sealed in that cursed graveyard. And yet, somehow I was still here, breathing, moving, living. But was it really living? Every day since, I felt as if I was being pulled back, as if I were walking through life with an invisible tether, constantly tightening around my neck. I kept thinking about the woman's words in the graveyard, her smile as she whispered, "You've been mine since the moment you stepped into this graveyard. Why? Why did she say that? Why didn't she just take me like she did the others?" I tried to move on. I really did. I tried to return to my routine, going to work, seeing friends, but it all felt hollow. At night, I locked myself inside my apartment, afraid to sleep, knowing the dreams would come. And they always did. But now, they were different. She wasn't just standing in the shadows, watching from afar. Now she was closer, her bony fingers reaching out for me, cold breath whispering in my ear. Each time I woke, my heart racing, drenched in sweat, I could still hear her voice. "You can't escape the grave." One night, after another sleepless stretch, I finally gave in. I grabbed my laptop and started researching anything I could find about the graveyard, the old church, the forgotten town it once belonged to. There had to be answers, something that would explain what happened to us, why we were marked. Hours turned into days as I sifted through obscure local histories and old newspaper clippings. The town had no name anymore, only referred to as the Forgotten Parish. In the late 1800s. It had been a small farming community, isolated from the rest of the world. But something happened, something that erased it from history. A plague had swept through the town, killing almost everyone in a matter of weeks. The townspeople, desperate for answers, had turned to superstition. There were whispers of dark rituals, sacrifices meant to ward off the disease. But none of it worked. Eventually, the remaining survivors fled, leaving the dead to rot in the abandoned churchyard. That's when the rumors started about a woman who had been buried alive as part of the townspeople's last desperate attempt to stop the plague. They believed she had been cursed, blamed for bringing the sickness to the town. She was entombed in a shallow grave, still breathing, as the townspeople performed rites they believed would seal her spirit forever. But they were wrong. The woman's curse didn't end with her death. It lingered, infecting the graveyard itself, trapping the souls of those who wandered too close. Her spirit still roamed the grounds, searching for the living to claim, to join her in the forgotten graves. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding as the pieces started to fit together. The gravestones with our names, the dreams, the deaths. We had all been marked the moment we stepped into that cursed place. And now, she was coming for me. I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. I knew it was only a matter of time before she took me too. There had to be a way to break the curse, to free myself from the grip of the graveyard. I had to go back. It was insane, I knew that. But staying here, waiting for her to claim me, was a slow death. At least if I returned, I had a chance to fight back. I packed a bag with essentials, a flashlight, some food, and a few supplies I thought might help. though I had no idea what I was up against. As night fell, I made my way back to the graveyard, my heart pounding in my chest the entire drive. The closer I got, the more the air seemed to thicken, a sense of wrongness settling over the landscape like a suffocating blanket. When I finally reached the entrance, my hands trembled as I pushed open the rusty iron gate, its creak echoing through the stillness. The graveyard looked exactly the same as before, silent, abandoned, untouched by time. But there was a heaviness to the air, a palpable sense of dread that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I forced myself to move forward, stepping over the overgrown grass, my eyes scanning the gravestones. And there was my name, carved into the weathered stone, the date still marked for that day I had been found in the woods. The woman was waiting for me. I could feel her presence, watching from the shadows, just like before. I took a deep breath and called out, "What do you want from me?" Silence. I stepped closer to the center of the graveyard, where we had found the old church. The entrance was still sealed, the doors bound with thick, rusted chains. But I could feel it now, something dark and malevolent thrumming beneath the earth. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. For a long moment, nothing happened. And then the wind picked up, cold and biting, swirling around me. The temperature dropped so rapidly that my breath came out in thick, white puffs. The grass rustled, the trees swayed, and a figure stepped out from the shadows. The woman in white. Her long, tattered dress trailed behind her, and her hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. She moved slowly, almost gracefully, her pale face expressionless as she approached. "You've returned," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Why?" I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet her gaze. "I need to end this." She tilted her head, her hollow eyes seeming to pierce through me. "You cannot end what has already begun. You belong to the grave now." "No," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't. There must be a way to break the curse." Her lips curled into a cruel smile. "The curse cannot be broken. The moment you stepped into this place, you sealed your fate." I took a step back, my mind racing. There had to be something, some way to escape. "You were cursed," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "They buried you alive. But that curse doesn't have to be passed on. You can stop this." For a moment she hesitated, her gaze flickering with something I couldn't quite read. Then she laughed, a cold, hollow sound that sent chills down my spine. "Stop," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "I cannot stop. I am bound to this place, just as you are." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. There has to be a way. But before I could finish, the ground beneath me began to tremble. The earth shifted, and I stumbled, falling to my knees as the air grew thick with the smell of decay. The gravestones around me seemed to blur, their inscriptions changing, morphing into new names, new dates. I looked down at my hands and my blood ran cold. My skin was pale, almost translucent, like hers. My veins stood out, dark and twisted beneath the surface, and my heartbeat, it was slowing, growing weaker with each passing second. The graveyard was claiming me. "No," I screamed, scrambling to my feet. "I won't let you take me." But the woman only smiled, her hollow eyes glowing with a cold, unfeeling light. "You cannot escape the grave," she whispered, her voice like a death knell. I could feel it now, the pull of the earth, the weight of the curse bearing down on me. But I refused to give in. With the last of my strength, I ran. I don't know how I made it out of the graveyard. The world was a blur of shadows and cold wind, but somehow I found myself at the edge of the woods, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I collapsed to the ground, I knew it wasn't over. The woman in white was still out there, waiting for me, her curse bound to my soul. And one day I knew she would come for me again. I had escaped the graveyard, but not the grave. The forgotten graveyard still stands, abandoned and overgrown, its secrets buried beneath layers of time and decay. Those who wander too close never return, their fates sealed by the curse of the woman in white. But the graveyard's hunger is never sated. And one day when the moon is high and the wind howls through the trees, it will call again. Will you answer? May. Chapter 7. The Final Return. Months passed after my last encounter with the woman in white, and I tried everything I could to move on with my life. But no matter how hard I tried, no matter how far I ran from that cursed graveyard, it lingered. The darkness hung over me like a shadow, something I couldn't shake off. It was as though the air itself around me was poisoned whispers in the wind, fleeting glimpses of pale figures in the corners of my vision. My friends were gone, my sleep was haunted, and I was left questioning my sanity. I couldn't live like this anymore. There was no peace, no comfort in anything. And the woman's voice, "You belong to the grave." Every time I closed my eyes, I felt her, closer now, her cold, skeletal hand reaching out. The tug grew stronger each night, the nightmares more vivid. She didn't just want me anymore, she needed me. It was as if her existence was tied to mine now, and she was growing impatient. I had escaped the grave once, but no one escapes it twice. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back. But this time it wasn't about finding answers or breaking the curse. It was about facing her, about accepting that I couldn't run anymore. I had to confront the inevitable, no matter the cost. On a cold, foggy evening, I found myself driving back to the same forest, the same winding road that led to the forgotten graveyard. The mist clung to the air, swirling around the car as the sky darkened overhead. The world seemed to grow quieter the closer I got, the usual hum of life replaced by a deep, unnatural stillness. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for me to arrive. I parked the car just outside the rusted iron gate, staring at the old, twisted trees that loomed ahead. The graveyard looked exactly the same as it had the last time I was here, abandoned, decayed, with the crooked gravestones barely visible through the thick fog. But this time something felt different. The air was heavier, charged with an oppressive energy that pressed against my chest, making it hard to breathe. I took a deep breath and pushed open the gate. It groaned loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness. Each step I took felt like a march toward doom, but I couldn't stop myself. There was no turning back now. The pull was too strong, like an invisible force drawing me deeper into the graveyard's embrace. The fog thickened as I moved between the gravestones, the outlines of the tombs barely visible in the gloom. I could feel her now, her presence all around me, watching from the shadows. The temperature dropped even lower, and my breath came out in small, trembling clouds. I stopped in front of the same gravestone with my name etched into it. The inscription was still there, as clear as ever: my name, my date of birth, and the date I had been found in the woods. The earth beneath my feet felt unstable, shifting slightly as though something was moving underneath. And then she appeared. The woman in white stepped out from the fog, her pale form gliding silently across the ground. Her face was the same sunken, hollow eyes, lips twisted into a cruel, knowing smile. Her white dress billowed around her, torn and stained with the dirt of the grave. "You've come back," she whispered, her voice soft but sharp, like the hiss of a snake. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I had no choice. Her smile widened, and she took a step closer. "You never had a choice. From the moment you entered this place, you were mine." I could feel the ground trembling beneath me now, the earth shifting as though something below was waking up. The grave was hungry, and it wanted me. "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you take me that night?" She tilted her head, studying me with those empty eyes. "Because you were meant to bring others. You led them here, didn't you? Your friends. They were claimed because of you." The weight of her words crashed over me, a wave of guilt and horror. She was right. I had brought them here, and now they were gone, consumed by the grave. But I had survived. Why? But now she continued, her voice soft and almost tender. "Your time has come. The grave will have you, just as it had them." The ground shook harder, and I stumbled back, feeling the cold earth shifting beneath my feet. My heart raced as I looked around, desperate for a way out, but there was none. The fog thickened, swirling around me like a living thing, trapping me in place. "You can't escape the grave," she whispered, her voice echoing all around me. I watched in horror as the gravestones around me began to crumble, the earth cracking open. Skeletal hands, twisted and decayed, started to reach up from the ground, grasping at the air. The dead were waking, drawn to the living, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The ground was swallowing me, pulling me down, the earth turning to cold, grasping mud that clung to my skin. I could feel it now, the pull of the grave. It wanted me. It had always wanted me. The woman stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. "You belong here with the others. Forever." I screamed, struggling against the earth that was dragging me down. My hands clawed at the ground, trying to find something, anything to hold on to, but it was no use. The more I struggled, the deeper I sank. The cold mud filled my lungs, choking me as I gasped for air. And then everything went black. I woke to silence. For a moment I thought I was dead, that I had finally been claimed by the grave. But as I opened my eyes, I realized I wasn't in the graveyard anymore. I was lying on the ground, surrounded by trees. The mist was gone, and the air was still. I sat up slowly, my head spinning. How had I gotten here? My body ached, my clothes were torn and covered in mud, but I was alive. Somehow I had escaped. But as I looked around, I realized I was not alone. Standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me with those same hollow eyes, was the woman in white. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared, her twisted smile never fading. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. I had to get out of here, had to run. But no matter how far I went, I knew deep down that it wasn't over. The woman in white would always be there waiting, watching. Because you can escape the graveyard, but you can never escape the grave. The end. The red string. I remember the day my life changed, not because something grand or momentous happened, but because of a simple red string. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the leaves outside my apartment window falling in slow, graceful arcs, and I was going about my usual routine laundry, emails, catching up on a few overdue assignments for work. I didn't notice it at first, not until I reached for my keys on the hallway table. There, looped around the keyring, was a thin, crimson string. I paused, staring at it for a moment, assuming it was just a piece of thread caught on my keys. My first instinct was to pull it off, but the way it was tied gave me pause. It wasn't accidental. The knot was intentional, a perfectly formed bow. Tight, deliberate. For a second, I stood there, my hand hovering above the keys, an irrational chill running down my spine. A wave of unease settled over me, though I couldn't explain why. My logical mind dismissed it as nothing, but there was something about that string that felt wrong. I didn't own anything that color. No clothes, no accessories. How had it gotten there? Pushing the unease aside, I untied the string and tossed it into the trash, grabbing my keys as if nothing had happened. I had work to do. I couldn't let some silly piece of thread get in the way. That night, though, the red string returned. I had almost forgotten about it by the time I went to bed. After hours of staring at a computer screen, responding to endless emails, I was exhausted. As I settled into my sheets, ready to drift off into sleep, I felt it a soft, slight tug on my wrist. In the quiet of the room, the sensation was sharp and clear. I pulled my hand from under the blanket, and there it was, tied snugly around my wrist in the same deliberate bow, the red string. I sat up immediately, heart pounding. My eyes darted around the room, but I was alone. The door was closed, the windows shut. No one else could have been here. I tore the string off, more forcefully this time, and threw it on the floor. I didn't want to think about how it had found its way back to me. But sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel the pressure on my wrist, as if the string were still there, tightening slowly. The next day, I told myself to forget it. Things like this happen all the time, right? I probably hadn't noticed it tied to something else. Maybe I'd unknowingly looped it around my wrist while half asleep. Still, the creeping sense of dread gnawed at me, lingering in the background of my thoughts as I went through the day. It was a Saturday, and I had planned to meet up with some friends that evening, a rare social escape from my otherwise uneventful life. I tried to shake off the morning's weirdness, focusing on the warmth of the cafe and the sound of their voices. But the red string wouldn't leave my mind. The conversation felt distant, and I couldn't bring myself to enjoy it. It wasn't until I excused myself to go to the bathroom that I felt that all too familiar sensation. As I washed my hands, I glanced into the mirror, and my stomach dropped. My reflection stared back at me, pale and unsettled, but it wasn't my face that held my attention. It was my wrist. The red string was there again, tied in the same perfect bow, its crimson stark against my skin. My heart raced. I hadn't felt it earlier, but there it was, mocking me. I frantically untied it, my hands trembling, and stuffed it into my pocket. How was this happening? I checked every pocket, every inch of my clothing, but there was no explanation. No logical reason. When I returned to the table, I barely heard the conversation. My thoughts were consumed by that string. I stayed for a little while longer before making an excuse to leave. As I hurried back to my apartment, the feeling of being watched crept in. Every corner I turned, every glance over my shoulder, there was nothing there, but something about the air felt different, heavier. That night, I locked my door and double-checked my windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the string wasn't just some innocent prank or coincidence. I avoided sleep for as long as I could, but exhaustion eventually won. My body needed rest, even if my mind was screaming in protest. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a sharp pain in my wrist. I sat up, gasping, and there it was again, the red string, tighter this time, cutting into my skin. My breath quickened as I tugged at it, but it didn't come off as easily as before. It felt like it was part of me now, almost fused to my skin. I stumbled out of bed, my pulse racing as I grabbed a pair of scissors from my desk drawer. I had to get rid of it, had to cut it away. But as I brought the blades down to the string, a strange feeling washed over me, a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread that I couldn't explain. My hand froze. What was I doing? Why was I so scared to cut it? I looked down at my wrist again, and that's when I saw it. The string wasn't just around my wrist anymore. It was leading away from me, stretching out across the floor and winding through the apartment, out the door, and down the hallway. I could see it now, an impossibly long line of crimson leading somewhere I couldn't see. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands clammy as I followed the string with my eyes. It didn't make sense. How could it be so long? I hadn't felt it before. Where was it leading? Slowly, cautiously, I began to follow the string. The hallway outside my apartment was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of a street lamp filtering through the windows. The red string stretched ahead of me, winding through the corridors like a trail I couldn't avoid. I hesitated, but something inside me urged me forward, like a compulsion I couldn't resist. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The string led me further into the building, down staircases I had never noticed before. Everything felt strange. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. I could feel the pressure mounting in my chest, as if the further I went, the more trapped I became. Finally, I reached a door at the end of a narrow hallway, an old, wooden door that looked out of place among the modern walls of the building. The red string slipped underneath it, disappearing into the darkness beyond. My hand shook as I reached for the knob. It was unlocked. I pushed the door open and stepped into the room beyond, the air cold and stale. The room was small, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, and empty except for a mirror on the far wall. But it wasn't the reflection in the mirror that terrified me. It was what lay on the floor in front of it. There, tangled in the red string, was a body, my body. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. It wasn't possible. I was standing right here, alive. But the body on the floor was unmistakably me, wearing the same clothes, the same features frozen in an expression of horror. And wrapped around its wrist, the red string pulled tighter, disappearing into the mirror. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the room. The string tightened around my wrist again, and I screamed as the pressure became unbearable. The mirror in front of me began to shimmer, distorting, and as I stared into it, I saw something moving on the other side, a shadowy figure, waiting, watching. Its hand reached out from the glass, pulling on the string, tugging me toward the reflection, toward my fate. The red string pulled tighter and tighter, dragging me closer to the mirror, my reflection smiling grimly back at me. I couldn't escape. I never believed in the red string, not until it was too late. They say the string connects you to your fate, leading you towards something you can't outrun. But what they don't tell you is that it isn't just some superstition. It's real. And once it finds you, there's no cutting it loose. It's only a matter of time before it pulls you in. The room grew colder as I felt the pull of the red string tighten around my wrist, my heart racing faster with each passing second. I tried yanking it off again, but it was futile. The string was no longer just a physical object. It felt alive, like it had a will of its own. I staggered back from the mirror, my eyes glued to the shimmering surface, unable to look away. The figure behind the glass grew clearer, its form slowly becoming more defined. It was human almost, but its eyes, they were empty, hollow. There was no reflection of light in them, no sign of life, only darkness. And yet, it smiled. That grin chilled me to my core, as if the figure could see right through me, understand every one of my fears. It was like looking at a grotesque parody of myself. The figure raised its hand again, and I felt the string tug sharply, dragging me closer to the mirror, inch by inch. Panic set in. I clawed at the floor, trying to find anything to hold on to, anything to resist the pull. But the room had changed. The once familiar walls now felt distorted, and the floor beneath me seemed to shift, growing slick and cold. I glanced back at the door, desperate to escape, but it was gone. Only an endless black void stretched where it had been. I was trapped. The string jerked again, harder this time, nearly knocking me off my feet. My breath quickened as the mirror rippled, almost like the surface of water, and I realized what it was doing. It was trying to pull me through. It wanted me inside. My reflection in the mirror began to distort, the face warping and twisting into something unrecognizable, something monstrous. "No," I muttered, my voice trembling. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But it was real. The pain in my wrist, the chill in the air, the growing sense of dread that gnawed at my insides, there was no escaping it. The red string had chosen me, and it wasn't going to let me go. I stumbled to my feet, the red string now coiled tightly around my arm like a snake. The figure in the mirror stepped closer to the surface, reaching out as if inviting me into its world. Its mouth moved, and though no sound came out, I understood the words it was mouthing. "Come closer. It's your turn." My knees buckled, but I forced myself to stand, backing away from the mirror as far as I could. But there was nowhere left to go. The string was pulling tighter, the air felt suffocating, and the room seemed to close in around me. In a fit of desperation, I grabbed the scissors I had left on the floor, trembling as I brought them to the string. I had to cut it. I had to break the connection, no matter the risk. But just as I was about to slice through the thread, the room shifted again. The mirror flickered, the figure inside now hovering closer to the surface. It reached out, and this time, I could feel its presence physically, its cold, icy grip around my wrist, pulling me into the mirror's depths. I fought against it, my hands shaking, trying to steady the scissors, but the pressure was unbearable. The string had sunk into my skin now, almost part of me, its presence inescapable. Suddenly the figure's face pushed through the glass, distorting the surface as if it were made of liquid. It was grinning too wide, too unnatural, and its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I could feel its breath, icy and deathly, washing over me as it whispered in a voice that chilled my bones. "You were chosen." The scissors fell from my hands. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in terror, but the next thing I knew, the mirror's surface rippled, pulling me forward with a violent jerk. My body lurched and I screamed, but it was no use. The red string had me now, binding me to the will of the creature behind the glass. I could feel my feet leaving the floor, the pull too strong to resist. I reached out desperately for anything to hold onto furniture, the walls, anything but the room itself seemed to be vanishing into the dark void. The world around me was disappearing, piece by piece, as the mirror consumed everything. My reflection, once human, now grinned back at me with an impossibly wide mouth, its eyes dark and endless. Just as I felt myself being dragged into the cold, glassy surface, everything went silent. Time slowed, and for a brief moment, I found myself staring into the abyss of the mirror. Then, without warning, the glass shattered. I woke up gasping, cold sweat pouring down my face. The room was pitch black, but it felt normal. My heart was racing, my wrist throbbing where the string had once been, but when I looked down, it was gone. There was no string, no mirror, nothing but me, alone in the dark. I scrambled out of bed, flicking on the lights, half expecting to see the red string coiled around my wrist again, or the figure lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. The room was just as it had always been. Had it been a dream? Some terrible, vivid nightmare? My eyes scanned the room, desperate for an explanation. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone on the nightstand, ready to call someone, anyone, to tell them what had happened. But when I picked up the phone, my stomach dropped. There, tied neatly around the phone's charging cable, was a red string. They say the red string isn't a myth, it's a curse. Once it chooses you, there's no escape. It will follow you, no matter where you go, no matter what you do, and no one knows what happens when it pulls you in for good. I'm still here for now. But every night I find it, on my door, around my keys, or tied to my bedpost. Always waiting, always tightening. I know it's only a matter of time before it pulls me back to that mirror. The string doesn't let go. It never does. The days passed in a blur, each one more unsettling than the last. The red string continued to appear in places I couldn't explain, around my coffee mug, tied to my shoes, even woven into my sheets. No matter how many times I got rid of it, it always came back, mocking me. Its presence was subtle but constant, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I tried to ignore it. I really did. I avoided mirrors entirely, refused to look into reflective surfaces, and kept the lights on at all times. But it didn't matter. The string was patient, persistent. It was tightening its grip, and I could feel it. Then, one evening, everything changed. I had just returned from work, exhausted and mentally drained from trying to keep myself grounded in reality. I hadn't seen the string for most of the day, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, it was over. Maybe I had broken whatever curse had haunted me. But as I stepped into my apartment, I saw it. The red string was back this time, draped across the entire room. It was woven intricately across the ceiling, walls, and floor, crisscrossing like a web of crimson threads. My heart sank. There was no escaping it this time. It had laid its trap, and I had walked right into it. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the room seemed to hum with an eerie energy. I turned slowly, my eyes following the path of the string. And then I saw it, the mirror, the same one from before, standing ominously in the center of the room, even though I was sure I had thrown it away weeks ago. The figure was waiting inside the glass, its hollow eyes fixed on me, that same wide grin stretched across its distorted face. It raised its hand, and the red string snapped tight, yanking me forward with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. I staggered, trying to resist, but the pull was relentless. This time there was no hesitation. The figure wasn't playing games anymore. It wanted me, and it was going to take me. As I was dragged closer to the mirror, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. But it wasn't me, it was the figure's face, staring back at me with that same twisted grin. My heart pounded in my chest, the terror rising to a fever pitch. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The string tightened, cutting into my skin, and with one final, violent tug, I was pulled into the mirror. Everything went black. For a moment, I felt nothing, no pain, no fear, just an endless void of darkness. But then, slowly, the world came back into focus. I was standing in the same room, but it was different. It was wrong. The air was thick, the light dim and eerie. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and the room stretched out impossibly long, like a nightmare that had no end. And there, standing in front of me, was the figure. But this time, it wasn't behind the glass. It was real, standing just a few feet away, its empty eyes locked onto mine. Its grin had faded, replaced with a look of hunger, of possession. It stepped closer, and I felt the string tighten again, pulling me toward it. My legs were frozen, my body refusing to move. I could feel my mind unraveling, the reality I knew slipping away. The figure leaned in, its cold breath on my face, as it whispered, "You're mine now." I wanted to run, to scream, to fight back, but I couldn't. The string was part of me now, its pull inescapable. I was trapped in this twisted mirror world, bound to the figure that had been haunting me from the start. In the reflection, I could see my own face, no longer mine, but twisted, hollow, and grinning. The red string was tied tightly around my wrist, pulling me deeper into the darkness. There was no escape. The last thing I saw before the world faded to black was my reflection, staring back at me with empty, hollow eyes. And then, nothing. They say the red string only comes for those who are chosen. Once it finds you, there's no going back. It will drag you into its world, and you'll become part of the curse, trapped forever in the mirror's twisted reflection. I can't say how long I've been here. Time doesn't work the same way anymore. But I know there's no escape from the red string. It never lets go. And now it's waiting for its next victim. The end. The Masked One. I don't know why I agreed to go to that party. I'm not one for big crowds or wild nights, but it was Halloween and my friends were relentless. "Come on, it's just a costume party," they said. "You can wear a mask and nobody will even know you're there." I don't know why that sounded comforting at the time. So I went, wearing a cheap, plastic mask I'd found in a bin at a discount store. It was simple, white, with hollow eyes and a small smile. I thought it looked unsettling, but in a kitschy, cheap Halloween way, not enough to scare anyone for real. The house was packed. People swarmed the hallways, spilling drinks and laughing way too loud. The music pounded in my ears, but it felt like it was coming from far away, like I was stuck underwater. I kept to the edges, trying to stay out of the chaos. About an hour into the party, I found myself standing alone in the corner of the living room, watching everyone else. That's when I saw him. Or across the room, half hidden in the shadows, there was someone standing completely still. He was tall, wearing a dark cloak that blended into the dim light, and on his face was a mask, not like mine, a cheap plastic one. His was old, maybe even handmade, and it was cracked along the edges like it had been worn for years. The mask had no expression, no smile, no frown, just blank, hollow eyes and a cold, flat surface. I stared at him for a while, wondering who he was. His presence was unnerving, even in a room full of drunk people in ridiculous costumes. The more I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. There was something wrong about the way he stood there, perfectly still, like he wasn't part of the scene, like he didn't belong. Then his head turned just slightly, and the hollow eyes of the mask locked onto mine. I froze. He didn't move, didn't say anything, but I could feel him watching me. The crowd shifted between us, and for a moment I lost sight of him. When I looked back, he was gone. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I brushed it off. It was Halloween, after all. Everyone was trying to be creepy. I wasn't about to let some random guy in a mask ruin my night. I grabbed another drink, tried to laugh it off, but no matter how much I told myself it was nothing, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. The night wore on, and I saw him again. And again, always at a distance, always watching. Every time I glanced his way, he would disappear into the crowd or the shadows, but I knew he was there, following me with those empty, hollow eyes. By the end of the party, I was rattled. I needed to leave. The crowd had thinned out. People stumbling home were passing out on the couches, but I couldn't stay. I slipped out the front door, breathing in the cool night air, hoping it would clear my head. The street was empty, and the sounds of the party faded behind me as I walked. The farther I got from the house, the more at ease I began to feel. Maybe it was just the alcohol or my nerves playing tricks on me. Maybe that masked figure was just someone trying to scare people. It was Halloween, after all. I turned the corner, and that's when I saw him. He was standing at the end of the street, bathed in the yellow glow of a street lamp, perfectly still, just like before. The same cloak, the same cracked, expressionless mask. He was waiting for me. My heart pounded, and I stopped in my tracks. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't part of some party game. He was following me. I took a step back, and so did he. I turned and started walking faster, my feet moving quicker than my thoughts could process. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the faint, deliberate footsteps behind me, echoing in the empty street. I was running now, panic gripping me as I sprinted down the block. The footsteps behind me grew louder, closer. I turned down alleyways, darted around corners, trying to lose him, but every time I thought I'd escaped, he was there, just at the edge of my vision, standing still, waiting. The streetlights flickered as I ran, casting long, distorted shadows. I could feel my lungs burning, my legs shaking, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Finally, I reached my apartment building, fumbling with the keys as I threw myself through the door, slamming it behind me. I stood there, breathless, pressing my back against the door, as if that alone could keep him out. The hallway was silent. For a moment, I let myself believe I was safe, that it was over. But then, from the other side of the door, I heard it. A single, deliberate knock. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The knock came again, louder this time. I didn't answer. I crept toward the peephole, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst out of my chest. Slowly, I pressed my eye to the peephole. He was standing there, on the other side of the door, inches from me. The mask's empty eyes stared directly into mine, as if he could see me through the door. For a moment, I thought I saw something move behind the mask, just the faintest flicker of something alive in those hollow eyes. Then he raised his hand, slowly, and placed it on the door. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I couldn't let him in. I couldn't let him get to me. Another knock. Louder. More insistent. I backed away, my eyes never leaving the door. My apartment felt smaller, the walls closing in. I grabbed my phone, dialing my friend, but the call wouldn't go through. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold it. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was nothing. Silence. I inched closer to the door, my heart pounding in my ears. Maybe he had left. Maybe it was over. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sign of movement. And then I heard it. A faint, scraping sound, like metal against wood. It was coming from the lock. The door handle turned. I don't remember much after that. I ran into my bedroom, locking myself inside. The door rattled as he tried to open it, but the lock held. I waited in the dark, terrified to move, terrified to breathe, as the sound of his footsteps echoed through my apartment. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. I couldn't tell anymore. But eventually everything went quiet. When I finally had the courage to open the bedroom door, he was gone. The apartment was empty, but the front door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. I never saw him again after that night, but sometimes when I'm alone I can feel those hollow eyes watching me, waiting. And every now and then when I come home late at night there's a knock on my door. But I never open it. The days that followed the encounter with the masked figure blurred into a haze of paranoia. I barely slept, every small sound jolting me awake, convinced that he was back. Every knock on my door, every creak of the floorboards, sent me spiraling into panic. My apartment no longer felt like a refuge, it felt like a trap, and I was the prey. I tried to explain what happened to a few friends, but they brushed it off, thinking it was some Halloween prank or that I was too drunk to remember things clearly. It's just some guy in a mask, they said. Halloween's over. Relax. But I couldn't. I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't a trick or a prank, and that mask. There was something unnatural about it. Something far too ancient and too real for me to explain away. I started noticing things around my apartment, things out of place. It started small, a chair moved slightly from where I'd left it. My keys left on the counter when I distinctly remembered placing them by the door. At first I thought it was just my anxiety playing tricks on me. But then, the scratches appeared. I woke up one morning to find thin, shallow scratches etched into the wood of my front door. The scratches weren't random, they formed a crude shape, like someone had used a blade to carve an outline of the mask, the same one I'd seen that night. I stared at the door in disbelief, my stomach twisting into knots. He was toying with me. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself I was imagining things, but deep down I knew he wasn't finished with me. The knock came that night, 3 slow, deliberate taps, just like before. I didn't answer. I didn't even breathe. I stayed frozen in bed, my body rigid with fear, listening as the knocks echoed through the apartment. Then, silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. Things escalated after that. The scratches became more frequent, deeper. They were on my walls now, inside the apartment, like they were following me. I heard footsteps in the hallway when I knew I was alone. My lights flickered every evening, plunging the apartment into darkness for just long enough to make my heart race. And always, the knocks. 3 slow taps that filled me with dread. I tried everything to protect myself. I changed the locks, installed extra security, even started sleeping with a knife under my pillow. Nothing worked. The knocks never stopped. It didn't matter what I did, where I went. He always found me. One night, after another sleepless stretch of hours, I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a bag, booked a last-minute hotel, and left the apartment behind. It felt like the only option left to put as much distance as I could between myself and whatever had latched onto me. For a while, the hotel room felt like a haven. The silence was comforting, the bed unfamiliar but free of any knocks or scratches. I almost started to believe that I could move on from this nightmare, that the masked figure was somehow tied to that apartment. That is, until the phone rang. It was past midnight, and I had barely drifted off when the shrill ringing jerked me awake. Groggy, I fumbled for the phone, half expecting it to be the front desk. Hello, my voice was hoarse, thick with exhaustion. No answer. I waited, listening to the dead air on the other end of the line. I was about to hang up when I heard the slow, deliberate sound of someone breathing. My blood turned to ice. Who is this? I demanded, trying to keep the panic from creeping into my voice. The breathing stopped. Then came the sound that made my heart nearly stop. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, not on my door, but through the phone, as if someone was standing right next to me, tapping on wood. I slammed the phone down and bolted upright. My chest heaved, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. How had he found me? How could he have possibly known where I was? I ran to the door, pressing my ear against it, listening for any sign of movement outside. Silence. I peered through the peephole, nothing. No one was there. The hallway was empty. My hands were shaking as I double-checked the locks, heart racing, my breath ragged. I spent the rest of the night curled up on the bed, wide-eyed and terrified, waiting for the next knock. But it didn't come. The next morning I left the hotel. I didn't even bother to check out properly. I just threw my things in the car and drove. I drove for hours, not caring where I was going, as long as it was far away. But no matter how far I went, the feeling never left me. That hollow, gnawing sensation that I was being watched. That those empty eyes behind the mask were following me, waiting. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to outrun it, moving from place to place, but it always found me. The scratches appeared again, etched into the walls of every room I stayed in. The knocks returned, sometimes faint, sometimes so loud I thought they would break down the door. But no matter what I did, I could never find him. I could never catch him. I don't know how much longer I can keep running. The knocks are more frequent now. Sometimes they happen in broad daylight, when I'm out in public, as if he's taunting me. I hear the footsteps everywhere I go, slow and deliberate, always just behind me. I've thought about facing him. About opening the door the next time he knocks. Maybe then it will stop. Maybe then I'll understand why he chose me, why he won't leave me alone. But deep down, I know it won't end that way. I've seen too much, felt too much fear to believe it's that simple. And so I run. But I'm tired now. So tired. If you hear the knocks, don't answer. Whatever you do, don't look behind the mask. The night I finally gave in was cold, bitterly cold. I was holed up in another nameless, forgettable hotel room on the outskirts of a town that looked like it had been forgotten by time. My heart pounded in my chest, the same as every night before, knowing what was coming. The knocks had started earlier that evening, faint at first, just enough to set my nerves on edge, then growing louder, closer. 3 taps. Then silence. Then I sat there in the dark, gripping the handle of the kitchen knife I'd kept by my side for what felt like months now. My mind was racing with a single thought: what if this never stops? Every rational part of me screamed to keep running, to get back in the car and drive as far as I could, but I knew deep down I couldn't run anymore. My legs trembled as I stood up and walked toward the door, my breath shallow, my throat dry. I could feel the weight of his presence before I even reached the door. The air felt heavier, suffocating, like the space around me had shrunk, trapping me in this moment. I stared at the door for what seemed like hours, listening to the dead, heavy silence. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps. I swallowed hard, my hand hovering over the door handle. There was no going back now. The fear that had been gnawing at me for so long suddenly shifted into a cold, paralyzing numbness. I had to face him. It was the only way this could end. I gripped the handle and turned it, the door creaking open slowly, almost as if it too was afraid of what was on the other side. There he stood. The same mask, pale and expressionless, covered his face. His dark, hollow eyes bored into me, the same unsettling calmness radiating from him. He stood motionless, his head slightly tilted to the side, as if studying me. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise, my stomach churning as I looked into those voids where eyes should have been. For a moment I couldn't move. My legs locked in place, my breath caught in my throat. But then something shifted inside me. The fear, the exhaustion, the endless nights of running, it all came crashing down in a wave of anger, desperation, and confusion. Why, I croaked, barely able to get the words out. What do you want from me? The masked figure remained still, his head slowly tilting the other way, as if considering my question. For the first time I saw movement beneath the mask. His lips, the only visible part of his face, began to curl into the faintest of smiles, a grotesque mockery of any emotion. And then he spoke. His voice was low, a rasping whisper that seemed to crawl into my ears like ice-cold fingers. I don't want anything from you. I felt the blood drain from my face. I hadn't expected an answer. I had barely expected him to be real, and now he was standing here, speaking to me, his presence more terrifying than any nightmare I could have imagined. If you don't want anything, why are you here? My voice trembled, the knife in my hand shaking uncontrollably. The smile faded, replaced by a look of something far darker, amusement, perhaps. Because you opened the door. My blood ran cold. I staggered back, clutching the knife tightly, but it felt useless, like a child's toy in my hand. The weight of what he said sank in. I had invited him in. I had opened the door. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, closing the space between us. I wanted to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. All I could do was stand there as he loomed over me, his empty eyes boring into mine. You let me in, he whispered, his voice filling the room like a deathly wind. And now I'm a part of you. I blinked, trying to understand, trying to grasp what he meant. But as I looked into his hollow gaze, I realized something horrifying. The reflection in his eyes, no, the absence of my reflection. The masked figure wasn't standing in the doorway anymore. He wasn't in front of me. He was me. My heart stopped. I stumbled back, looking down at my own hands, but they felt foreign, like they didn't belong to me anymore. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. I looked back up, and the figure was gone. The mask was gone. There was only my reflection in the cracked hotel mirror, the pale, blank face staring back at me. My own eyes, empty, hollow, like I had become part of the mask itself. I screamed, at least I think I did. But the sound didn't come out. My mouth opened, but all that escaped was silence, a hollow echo of the person I used to be. I was trapped now, locked behind the mask, and no matter how much I wanted to run, No matter how much I wanted to escape, I couldn't. Because now I was the one standing on the other side, and the knocking would never stop. It's strange how life can twist in ways you never expect, how the lines between reality and nightmare can blur so effortlessly until you're no longer sure which side you're standing on. I had spent so long trying to understand what the masked figure was, what it wanted, only to realize that I had been looking in the wrong direction the entire time. I wasn't the victim. I was the mask. The knocking, the relentless pursuit, the scratches on the walls, they weren't signs of him trying to get in. They were reminders that I was never truly alone, that this thing had been with me all along, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. When I think back on it, there were signs, small cracks in my sense of self, moments of uncertainty, flashes of a face I didn't recognize in the mirror. But I ignored them. I pushed them aside, convinced that it was all just fear, just stress. Now I realize the truth. The mask wasn't something external, it wasn't some entity or spirit haunting me. It was a reflection of everything I had tried to bury. The parts of myself I couldn't face, the darkness that had always lingered at the edges of my mind. And when I opened that door, when I let him in, I was really letting myself out. I don't know how long I've been like this, trapped behind the mask, wearing it like a second skin. Time has become meaningless, a swirling blur of memories that aren't really mine. Sometimes I catch glimpses of who I used to be, fragments of a life that feels distant, but they slip through my fingers like smoke. The knocks come less frequently now, but they never truly stop. They're not meant for me anymore. They're warnings for those who pass by, who might hear them and wonder. Warnings for those who might be tempted to open the door. I've accepted my place, though. I've become part of it, part of this endless cycle. And I know that someday someone else will hear the knocks, just like I did. They'll stand at the threshold, trembling with curiosity and fear, their hand hovering over the door handle. And when they open it, they'll see me standing there, mask and all, waiting to be let in. But it won't be me anymore. It will be them. And the cycle will continue. I can only hope they have the strength to resist, to turn away before it's too late. But I doubt it. Because in the end, we all open the door. We all let the mask in. And when we do, we become the thing we fear most. The knocks. They never really stop. The Curse of Winterbrook. I came to Winterbrook for peace, for isolation, for a chance to escape the suffocating noise of the world. I didn't come looking for adventure. I didn't come looking for anything, really, other than quiet. The house on the edge of the mountain town seemed like the perfect retreat, nestled among trees with views that stretched forever. Winterbrook had an eerie charm, its rustic wooden buildings and winding streets offering a quaint aesthetic. However, as I drove through the narrow lanes, the welcoming facades felt more like a mask hiding secrets. The locals seemed strange, insular, and distant, but I didn't care. I was used to being the outsider, and the last thing I wanted was to be drawn into whatever small-town drama haunted their lives. Little did I know that they were haunted in ways far worse than I could have imagined. The previous owner of my house had left it in disrepair, but I saw potential in its crumbling walls and creaking floorboards. As I unpacked my things, the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward me, wrapping me in an embrace that felt simultaneously welcoming and oppressive. The first night was uneventful, save for the strange sounds that echoed through the empty halls. The house had an unsettling quietness, broken only by the wind whispering through the trees outside. As I lay in bed, I thought I heard soft footsteps above me, but I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks. After all, old houses creaked and groaned. That was their nature. The next morning I set out to explore the town, eager to get a sense of the community. The main street was lined with small shops and a diner that looked as if it hadn't changed since the 1950s. As I walked in, the bell above the door tinkled, announcing my presence. The few patrons turned to look, their eyes filled with curiosity, but the warmth of their smiles was fleeting. They quickly returned to their meals, exchanging glances with one another, whispering in hushed tones. "Newcomer," I heard one woman say, her voice laced with a hint of warning. The diner's owner, a grizzled man named Frank, approached me with a forced smile. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, pouring me a cup of coffee that smelled rich and strong. "No, just moved into the old Harrow place," I replied casually, trying to gauge his reaction. His smile faltered, and I could see the color drain from his face. "You should be careful there. People say the Harrow place is cursed," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Cursed? What do you mean?" I pressed, intrigued. But Frank shook his head, waving a dismissive hand. "Just old tales. Nothing to worry about." He turned away, leaving me with a sense of unease that lingered like the bitter taste of coffee in my mouth. Returning home, I felt a chill settle in my bones. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house loomed larger than life, its windows like dark eyes glaring down at me. I hesitated before stepping inside, the air thick with anticipation. That night, as I settled into bed, heard it again, the soft, deliberate footsteps above me. This time I couldn't ignore it. Grabbing a flashlight, I ascended the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. Each creak of the floor echoed like a drum, amplifying my fear. The upper floor was dark, shadows dancing along the walls as I scanned the area. The hallway was empty, but I felt an unmistakable presence. As I stepped into the first room, I noticed the walls were adorned with strange symbols. They appeared to be scratched into the wood, deep grooves that seemed to pulse with an energy of their own. I ran my fingers over the marks, feeling an electric tingle shoot through me. Then I heard it, a whisper, barely audible, brushing against my ear like a soft caress. I spun around, but the room was empty. My breath quickened, and I backed away, the weight of the house pressing down on me. I fled to my room, locking the door behind me, but the chill remained, wrapping around me like a shroud. The next day, I decided to confront the townsfolk. If there was something I needed to know about the house, I would dig deeper. I made my way back to the diner, determined to speak to Frank again. This time I noticed a group of older men gathered at a table in the corner, their heads bowed together, whispering intently. As I approached, they fell silent, eyes darting to me before returning to their hushed conversation. "You should leave that house alone," Miss one of them, a tall man with a weathered face, finally spoke. "You don't want to get involved in things that don't concern you." "What do you mean?" I asked, frustration bubbling inside me. "Is it the symbols? What do they mean?" The man sighed, glancing around as if ensuring no one else was listening. "You're treading on sacred ground. The Harrow family made a deal with the mountain long ago, and it hasn't been right since." I pressed for more details, but he remained evasive. "You'll see," he said cryptically before turning away. That evening I returned home, determined to uncover the history of the house. I dug through the boxes left behind by Elijah Harrow, hoping to find something, anything that would explain the strange occurrences. His journals revealed fragments of a life spent in fear, speaking of a dark presence in the woods and the rituals that the townsfolk participated in to appease it. The deeper I read, the more I realized the connection between the house, the town, and the woman in white. She was mentioned frequently, a ghostly figure who would walk the streets, watching, waiting for her next victim. Days turned into weeks, each night filled with whispers and footsteps that grew more desperate. The townsfolk avoided me, their glances filled with pity and fear. I felt increasingly isolated, the walls of the house closing in. I stopped sleeping, haunted by dreams of the woman in white, her hollow eyes following me as I tried to escape. One night, I could no longer bear it. I decided to confront my fear head-on. Armed with my flashlight and a determination fueled by desperation, I ventured into the forest. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, casting the world into shadows that seemed alive. As I walked deeper into the woods, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with tension. The wind whispered secrets, and I felt as if the trees themselves were watching me. I stumbled upon a clearing where the symbols from the house were carved into the earth, glowing faintly in the moonlight. I could feel the energy pulsing around me, a a powerful force that seemed to beckon me closer. Suddenly, a cold wind blew through the clearing, and I felt a presence, a shadowy figure emerging from the trees. It was her, the woman in white. She stood before me, her veil obscuring her face, but her eyes piercing through the darkness, searching for something within me. "Why do you linger here?" she asked, her voice echoing through the clearing like a mournful song. "You should leave while you can." "Why? What do you want from me?" I cried out, my voice trembling. She stepped closer, and the air grew colder. "I am bound to this place, just as you are now. A curse will not let you go. You are marked." Panic surged through me as I backed away, desperate to escape. I turned and ran, the forest closing in around me, branches clawing at my skin. I stumbled back to the house, my heart racing, adrenaline fueling my flight. The woman's voice echoed in my mind, haunting my every thought. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it tight, but the whispers grew louder, filling the room with their cacophony. I could feel the house shifting around me, the walls closing in, suffocating me with their secrets. I knew I had to confront the truth. I had to face the curse that had claimed Elijah and so many others before him. The next morning, I set out to find Agnes, hoping she could provide answers, something to help me break the cycle. When I arrived at Agnes's home, I found her sitting on the porch, her eyes scanning the horizon as if she were waiting for something or someone. As I approached, she looked up, her expression a mixture of sorrow and understanding. "You've seen her, haven't you?" she asked, her voice steady. I nodded, unable to find my voice. "She's the one who watches over the cursed, a reminder of what happens when the pact is broken," Agnes continued. "The townsfolk believe that keeping the old ways will protect them, but they only serve to bind you to this place." "Is there a way to break the curse?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Agnes sighed deeply, her gaze drifting to the mountains in the distance. "You must confront the spirit of the mountain itself, uncover the truth of the pact made long ago. Only then can you hope to free yourself from her grasp." The days turned into a blur as I prepared for my confrontation with the spirit of the mountain. I studied Elijah's journals, piecing together the fragmented history of Winterbrook and the dark legacy of the Harrell family. As the next full moon approached, I could feel the tension building in the air, a palpable sense of dread that wrapped around me like a cloak. On the night of the full moon, I made my way back to the clearing. The moon hung high above, casting an ethereal glow over the symbols etched into the earth. I stood in the center, heart pounding as I called out to the spirit, hoping it would respond. As if in answer, a cold wind whipped through the clearing, and shadows danced around me. I felt the energy surge, a force pulling me toward the symbols. The air crackled with anticipation as I stood firm, determined to face whatever lay ahead. "Show yourself," I shouted, my voice echoing in the silence. The wind howled, and the shadows began to coalesce into a figure of massive form that loomed above me, dark and foreboding. The spirit of the mountain revealed itself, its eyes glowing like embers. "You dare disturb the balance," it boomed, voice echoing like thunder. "I seek the truth," I replied, standing my ground. "What happened to the Harrows? What is the curse that binds us all?" The spirit's form shifted, swirling like smoke, and I could feel its anger boiling beneath the surface. "The Harrows made a pact, a trade for prosperity in exchange for a soul to feed the mountain. They failed to deliver, and now you are caught in their web of deceit." In that moment, I understood the true nature of the curse. The woman in white was not merely a spirit, she was the soul promised to the mountain, bound to it by the betrayal of the Harrows. I could feel her sorrow and rage intertwined with the spirit's fury, a tragic tale of love and loss woven into the very fabric of Winterbrook. "I refuse to be a part of this," I shouted, voice unwavering. "I will not allow myself to be consumed by their sins." The spirit roared in anger, and the ground trembled beneath me. "You have no choice. You are marked by the past." But I felt a surge of strength rising within me, a fierce determination igniting my soul. "I will break this curse. I will find a way to free the woman and the town from this cycle." With those words, I reached deep into my heart, summoning the memories of love and loss I had experienced in my life. I envisioned the bonds that connect us all, our struggles, our triumphs, our shared humanity. The symbols around me glowed brighter, pulsing with energy as I poured my essence into the clearing. The spirit hesitated, confusion flickering across its dark form. "What is this?" it questioned, uncertainty creeping into its voice. Hope, I declared, holding firm. Hope for a new beginning, a chance to heal the wounds of the past. As the words escaped my lips, the clearing erupted in blinding light. The spirit howled in agony, and the woman in white emerged from the shadows, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. I reached out, extending my hand toward her, a bond of connection forged between us. In that moment, I felt the weight of centuries lift as the pact began to unravel. The whispers in the wind shifted to a gentle breeze, carrying the echoes of lost souls healing their wounds one by one. The woman in white stepped forward, her veil lifting to reveal her tear-streaked face. "You have freed me," she whispered, her voice now a soft caress rather than a mournful wail. "I didn't free you, we freed each other," I replied, tears streaming down my face as I felt a warmth envelop me. As dawn broke over Winterbrook, the cursed legacy of the Harrows began to fade into the past. The townsfolk awoke, feeling the change in the air. As I returned to my home, I could sense the weight of the house lifting, the walls no longer suffocating but breathing with life. The woman in white became a legend whispered among the townsfolk, a reminder of the power of connection, hope, and healing. Winterbrook transformed, slowly shedding its dark past, allowing light to seep in. And as for me, I finally found the peace I had sought, not just in solitude but in the bonds I forged with the spirits that lingered on the edge of the mountain. The curse was broken, but the story would live on, woven into the very essence of Winterbrook, a tale of darkness, redemption, and the unbreakable ties that bind us all. The curse reawakened. As the months passed, Winterbrook seemed to return to life. The weight that had hung over the town for generations was finally lifted, and for the first time, there was a sense of peace. The house that had once felt like a prison was now a sanctuary, filled with light and warmth. I had made peace with my past, with the town's dark history, and, most of all, with myself. But peace is a fragile thing, and in a place like Winterbrook, the shadows never truly disappear. It started innocently enough. A few strange occurrences here and there, an odd gust of wind on a calm day, whispers in the trees that hadn't spoken since I had freed the woman in white. At first, I brushed it off as nothing more than old habits resurfacing. After all, I had lived in fear for so long that it was only natural for my mind to still search for threats that no longer existed. But soon, the town began to change. The first sign. It was Agnes who first noticed something wasn't right. She came to my door one evening, her face pale and drawn, her usual calm demeanor replaced with quiet urgency. "I need to talk to you," she said, not bothering with formalities. I ushered her inside, offering her tea, but she waved it away, her hands trembling slightly. "It's happening again," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The curse. It's not gone." I froze. "What do you mean?" "We broke it. I saw it with my own eyes." Agnes shook her head, her eyes filled with fear. "I thought so too. But there are signs, things that I haven't seen in years. The birds, they're acting strange. And the trees, people say they've seen the symbols reappear." I felt a chill run down my spine. The symbols, the same ones I had discovered carved into the walls of my house, the ones that had been connected to the curse, were reappearing. "I need to see them," I said, my voice firm, despite the unease creeping in. We made our way to the forest the next morning. The sky was overcast, casting a gray pall over the town as we walked in silence. Agnes led me to the clearing where I had first confronted the spirit of the mountain, the place where I had broken the curse, or so I thought. As we approached, I could feel the air change, growing heavier with each step. The clearing looked the same at first glance, but then I saw them, the symbols freshly carved into the earth, glowing faintly in the dim light. My heart sank. "They weren't here yesterday," Agnes whispered. "Something has stirred." I knelt down, tracing the symbols with my fingers. The energy pulsing through them was unmistakable, alive, powerful, and ancient. "How could this be happening?" I murmured. "We broke the curse." Agnes was silent for a long moment before she spoke. "There's something you need to know about the curse. Something I didn't tell you before." I looked up at her, my heart pounding. "What?" "The curse wasn't just tied to the Harrow family. It's older than that, much older. The Harrows were simply the last to make the pact. The mountain, it demands something, always. A dark history revealed." Agnes led me back to her home, where she pulled out an ancient, leather-bound book. its pages yellowed with age and filled with strange symbols and handwritten notes. "This is the history of Winterbrook," she said, flipping through the pages. "The town was founded long before the Harrows arrived. The original settlers believed that the mountain held great power that could be harnessed if the right rituals were performed." I listened in silence as she recounted the story. The settlers had made a pact with the mountain, offering a sacrifice in exchange for protection and prosperity. For generations, the town had flourished under this pact, but it came at a terrible cost. Every few decades, a life was taken claimed by the mountain as payment for the town's continued survival. But something went wrong with the Harrows. Agnes continued. "They were the last to make the pact, but they didn't fulfill their end of the bargain. The woman in white. She was supposed to be the sacrifice, but the family tried to cheat the mountain, and in doing so they cursed the entire town." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. "But we freed her. I freed her." "Yes," Agnes said softly, "but the pact remains. The mountain still demands its due." Over the following weeks, strange events began to plague Winterbrook once more. The townspeople, who had been so relieved by the breaking of the curse, were now gripped by fear. Crops began to fail, livestock disappeared, and people reported seeing shadowy figures in the woods at night. The whispers in the wind grew louder, more insistent, and the once vibrant town began to wither under the weight of the unseen force that was reawakening. I tried to stay rational, to believe that there was a logical explanation for everything that was happening, but deep down I knew the truth. The curse had never truly been broken. It had only been paused, and now it was back with a vengeance. The townspeople turned to Agnes for guidance, and soon the old rituals that had been abandoned long ago were being resurrected. People began leaving offerings at the base of the mountain, small tokens of food, trinkets, anything they thought might appease the spirits that haunted the land. But the mountain demanded more than trinkets. It demanded a life. At first, no one wanted to acknowledge it, but as the days passed and the strange events continued, the whispers started. The town began to fracture, fear spreading like wildfire. Some of the older residents, those who still remembered the tales of the mountain's power, began to speak openly about the need for a sacrifice. "It's the only way," they would say in hushed tones. "We have to give the mountain what it wants." Others, particularly the younger generation, refused to believe it. They called it superstition, old wives' tales meant to scare children. But as more and more strange things began to happen, disappearances, mysterious deaths, the divide grew. I found myself caught in the middle, torn between the logic of my modern mind and the undeniable evidence that something supernatural was at work. The prophecy. One night, as I lay in bed, trying to ignore the whispers that had once again started to fill the house, Agnes came to me in a panic. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "I found something," she said breathlessly, thrusting the ancient book into my hands, "something I missed before." I sat up, flipping through the pages as she pointed to a passage written in the same strange script as the symbols that had reappeared in the clearing. "It's a prophecy," she whispered. "It says that the curse can be broken, truly broken, but only by a sacrifice of great importance." I frowned, scanning the passage. What kind of sacrifice? Agnes hesitated before speaking. "A willing one." I felt my blood run cold. "You mean someone has to offer themselves willingly to the mountain?" "Yes," she said quietly. "It's the only way to stop the cycle. If no one offers themselves, the mountain will continue to take lives at random, growing stronger with each death." I stared at her, my mind racing. It was unthinkable. Who would do such a thing? Who would willingly give their life to break a curse that had plagued the town for centuries? As the days passed after the ritual, Winterbrook seemed to exhale a sigh of relief. The dark energy that had suffocated the town for so long lifted, and the shadows that once clung to the streets like unwelcome guests began to fade. People returned to their lives, cautiously at first, as if waiting for the next disaster to strike, but eventually the old rhythms of life returned. For the townspeople, it was over. The curse had been lifted, and they could finally live without the constant dread that had haunted them for generations. The symbols no longer appeared, and the whispers in the wind had gone silent. It was as if the mountain had finally been satisfied. But for me, the ending was far more complicated. In the quiet moments when the town was asleep, and the moon hung high above the mountains, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The decision I had made, the choice to offer myself, not in death, but in blood, had been the only way to break the cycle, and yet the cost lingered. I would often wake in the middle of the night, my palm aching where I had made the cut, the memory of the clearing and its pulsing symbols vivid in my mind. The feeling that I had been chosen, that the mountain had marked me, never fully disappeared. Even now, as I walked through the town or sat in my house, I could feel its presence, watching from the distance, always waiting. There was a moment, just after the ritual, when I thought I would be consumed by the mountain's power. It was as if it wanted me, not just my blood, but my entire being. But something had pulled me back, a sense of unfinished business, or perhaps a recognition that I still had more to do in this life. The mountain had let me go, but I had no illusions about what that meant. It was a reprieve, not a release. In breaking the curse, I had bound myself to the very thing I sought to destroy. The mountain had taken what it needed, but it had left a part of itself with me, and I knew that, for the rest of my life, I was an oath. The town's legacy. Winterbrook would continue, just as it always had. The old superstitions, the strange rituals, they would fade with time, buried under the weight of modernity and the convenience of forgetting. The town would move on, and in a generation or two, the curse would become nothing more than a story passed down through the years, a tale to scare children around the fire. But for me, it would never truly end. Every time I looked at the mountains, I would remember the power that lurked beneath their surface. I would remember the sacrifices made, the lives lost to the greed of those who came before, and the blood that bound me to the land. There are things we can never truly escape. The past has a way of sinking its claws into us, pulling us back when we try to move forward. I had spent so much of my life searching for answers, for meaning in the chaos, and in the end, I found that some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. And yet, there was a strange comfort in that realization. Self-reflection. In those quiet moments of reflection, I came to understand something about myself that I had never fully acknowledged before. All my life, I had been running from the past, from my fears, from the truth of who I was. Moving to Winterbrook had been my way of escaping the world, of finding a place where I could hide from the things that haunted me. But the curse, the mountain, and everything that had happened had forced me to confront the one thing I had been avoiding for so long, myself. I realized that the curse wasn't just something that afflicted the town, it was inside me as well. My doubts, my insecurities, my need to control the uncontrollable, all of it was part of the darkness that had followed me my entire life. And in breaking the curse, I had broken something within myself too. I had spent so much time trying to make sense of the world around me, trying to impose order on the chaos. But in the end, the answers didn't come from outside, they came from within. The mountain had shown me that there were forces in the world beyond my understanding, forces that couldn't be controlled or tamed, and I had to learn to live with that uncertainty. It was a hard lesson, but a necessary one. Now, as I sit in my house staring at the mountains in the distance, I feel a sense of peace that I never thought I would find. Not because I have all the answers, but because I've learned to accept that some things are beyond my control. The curse may be broken, but the echoes of it remain, a reminder of the power that still lingers in the world and in me. Perhaps in the end, that's what the mountain wanted all along. Not a sacrifice of life, but a sacrifice of certainty, a recognition that we are all bound to forces greater than ourselves, and that sometimes the only way to move forward is to let go of the need to understand everything. The mountain is still there, watching, waiting, and so am I. But for the first time in a long time, I'm no longer afraid. The Midnight Stare. Chapter 1. Shadows of Decatur. There's something about growing up in a neighborhood like Decatur, Georgia, that stays with you. The streets were rough, worn with years of neglect, and even though it was home, it was the kind of place where you always had to keep your guard up. Walking home from school, you'd hear the distant wail of sirens, sometimes wondering which neighbor they were rushing toward this time. People minded their own business, and that was just how we lived. But the neighborhood wasn't just rough, it had an unsettling energy, especially at night. When the sun dipped below the horizon, the streets took on an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional shuffle of feet or the low hum of a passing car. To a 9-year-old like me, it felt like the dark had a life of its own, waiting for the chance to swallow you whole. For as long as I could remember, sleep had been my refuge from all of it. I didn't dream much, or if I did, I didn't remember. But then the sleepwalking started. It wasn't unusual for me to wake up outside, standing barefoot on the sidewalk, the cold cement biting at my feet, my pajamas fluttering in the warm Georgia breeze. I would stare around in a daze, struggling to understand how I had gotten there. The door to our house would always be wide open, as if I had simply wandered out, leaving the threshold exposed for anyone or anything to slip inside. I hated that feeling, that uncertainty of where I had been and how long I had been there. It felt like I was handing the night an invitation to my deepest fears. And yet, each time I would take a deep breath, wipe the sweat from my palms, and creep back through the door into the L. Every step felt like a challenge to the shadows that clung to the corners of the room, waiting for a chance to pull me back out into the night. But no matter how unsettling those nights were, they were nothing compared to what happened on that particular summer night. Chapter 2. The Figure at the Window. It was one of those suffocatingly hot nights where the air felt like a wet blanket pressing down on your chest. I could hear the low hum of our old ceiling fan struggling to keep up, the blades barely moving the thick air around. I remember tossing and turning, my sheets clinging to my sweaty skin. And then, without any warning, I was awake. But not the gradual, drowsy kind of waking up. No, this was different. I snapped awake, standing at the foot of my bed, staring at the window. The curtains, which I never touched, were pulled back, and the pale light of the moon cast an eerie glow across the room. For a second, I thought I was still sleepwalking, that maybe I'd done this to myself. But then I saw him. A man, standing outside my window, staring straight at me. I couldn't move. My mind was racing, screaming at me to do something, but my body refused to listen. He was just standing there, close enough that I could see the gleam of his skin under the moonlight. He was big, much bigger than anyone I'd ever seen, and completely hairless. His smooth, bald head reflected the pale light, and his face was so close to the glass that I could see every detail. No hair, no eyebrows, no expression, at least not at first. He just stared at me, his wide eyes scanning me like he was trying to figure out if I was real. It felt like an eternity, like time had stretched and warped around me. I wanted to run, to scream, to do something, but I was paralyzed by fear. And then, slowly, he began to move closer. He pressed his face right up against the window, his eyes wide and unblinking, like he was trying to get a better look. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I thought he might hear it. His expression changed then, from curiosity to confusion to something like fear. It was as if he wasn't sure what he was seeing. That's when I lost it. The scream tore out of me, raw and uncontrollable, ripping through the silence of the night. I was frozen in place, tears streaming down my face, my legs trembling, and I felt a warm trickle running down my leg as I stood there, completely helpless. The man's reaction was instant. His eyes grew wide with terror, and before I could process what was happening, he let out a high-pitched scream of his own. The sound was so out of place, like it didn't belong to someone his size. Then, in one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen, he stumbled backward, his arms flailing, and tumbled to the ground. But he didn't stop there. He scrambled to his feet and started running down the street, not in a straight line, but zigzagging like he was dodging something. His long legs carried him in these awkward, lurching strides, and he kept looking over his shoulder as if expecting something to be chasing him. I was still screaming when my mom burst into the room, her face pale with fear. She wrapped her arms around me, trying to calm me down, but I could barely speak. My voice came out in broken sobs as I tried to tell her about the man, the way he had been staring at me, the way he had screamed and ran away. She checked the window, looked outside, but by then the street was empty. There was no sign of him. Chapter 3: The morning after. The next morning, things seemed more normal. The oppressive weight of the night had lifted, and the sun shone brightly through the windows, as if to chase away the lingering shadows. But the memory of the man, his bald, glistening face and wide, terrified eyes stayed with me. I kept replaying it in my head, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it been real? I wasn't so sure. Maybe my mom was right. Maybe it had just been a nightmare. But when we found the screwdriver on the front porch, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. The door jamb was scratched, the handle bent slightly like someone had been trying to force it open. I tried telling my mom again, but she just brushed it off, saying the neighborhood had its share of creeps. Probably just some weirdo, she said, trying to break in. Scared him off with that scream of yours. She laughed it off, but I couldn't. Not fully. I knew what I'd seen, and the way the man had looked at me, the way he had reacted, haunted me. He had been terrified, not of breaking into the house, but of me. Of seeing me standing there, staring back at him through the window. Chapter 4: A lingering fear. For the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I passed that window, I could feel his eyes on me, even though I knew he wasn't there. At night, I started locking my door, hoping that it would somehow protect me. But it didn't help. The fear crept in anyway, whispering to me from the darkness, telling me that he'd come back. The sleepwalking stopped, at least for a while. I think my mind had decided that it wasn't safe to wander anymore, but the terror of that night lingered, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Years passed, and though the memory faded, it never really went away. Even now, as an adult, I still avoid looking out of windows at night. There's always that fear, that irrational, gnawing fear that I'll see him standing there again, staring in with those wide, bewildered eyes. Chapter 5: Reflections on Fear. People always say that childhood fears fade with time, that the things that terrify us when we're young lose their power as we grow older. But I don't believe that. I think the things that scare us the most, the things that burrow deep into our minds, never really leave. They just lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Sometimes when I tell the story, I laugh. I laugh at the absurdity of the man's reaction, at the way he screamed and tumbled and ran down the street in that ridiculous zigzag pattern. I laugh because it's easier than admitting how deeply it still affects me. But every once in a while, when I'm alone at night and the house is silent, I'll catch myself glancing at the window, half expecting to see that pale, hairless face staring back at me. And in those moments I realize that some fears never truly die. They just hide. Chapter 6: The Return. It was late one night when the weight of memories pulled me back to Decatur, as if the shadows were beckoning me. I had returned to visit my childhood home, a ramshackle place now covered in peeling paint and overgrown weeds. Nostalgia battled with dread, memories intertwining with the lingering fear of what I'd seen all those years ago. The house felt different, as if it had absorbed every whisper and sigh from my childhood. I could hear the creaks of the floorboards echoing in the empty halls, and the air was thick with an unsettling stillness. My mother had moved away long ago, leaving the house vacant, but the memories of my childhood and the terror of that night had not vacated with her. As I settled into a makeshift sleeping arrangement on the old couch, the haunting nostalgia mingled with an anxiety I thought I had long buried. Sleep eluded me, and I spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of that fateful night. Had I truly seen a man, or had my young mind conjured up a nightmare? But just as I began to drift off, a sound jolted me awake. It was a soft rustle from outside, barely audible but enough to send a rush of adrenaline through my veins. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was probably just the wind. But then came a more distinct noise, a tapping, gentle yet insistent, coming from the window. Fear surged through me, and I knew what I had to do. I had to look. I approached the window cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. With trembling hands, I pulled back the curtain, bracing myself for what I might see. And there he was. The figure stood in the moonlight, just like I remembered. Hairless, tall, with those wide, unblinking eyes fixed on me. But this time, there was something different. This time, he didn't look scared. He looked curious, his head tilting slightly to one side, as if trying to understand why I was looking back at him. I felt a chill wash over me, and my mind raced. I should scream, run away, but instead I was transfixed. The years fell away, and I was once again that terrified child, standing frozen in the dark. Why, I managed to whisper, my voice barely above a breath. The figure's expression shifted, morphing from curiosity to something deeper sadness. Regret? I couldn't tell. It took a tentative step closer, and my heart threatened to explode from my chest. But just as I began to drift off, a sound jolted me awake. It was a soft rustle from outside, barely audible but enough to send a rush of adrenaline through my veins. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was probably just the wind. But then came a more distinct noise, a tapping, gentle yet insistent, coming from the window. Fear surged through me, and I knew what I had to do. I had to look. I approached the window cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. With trembling hands, I pulled back the curtain, bracing myself for what I might see. And there he was. The figure stood in the moonlight just like I remembered, hairless, tall, with those wide, unblinking eyes fixed on me. But this time, there was something different. This time, he didn't look scared. He looked curious, his head tilting slightly to one side, as if trying to understand why I was looking back at him. I felt a chill wash over me, and my mind raced. I should scream, run away, but instead I was transfixed. The years fell away, and I was once again that terrified child, standing frozen in the dark. Why, I managed to whisper, my voice barely above a breath. The figure's expression shifted, morphing from curiosity to something deeper, sadness, regret. I couldn't tell. It took a tentative step closer, and my heart threatened to explode from my chest. "What do you want?" I asked, desperation creeping into my tone. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "To be seen." The words struck me, unraveling my fears and replacing them with an inexplicable sorrow. Suddenly, I understood. The terror he had shown all those years ago mirrored my own fear of the unknown, of being lost in the shadows of life. With a mix of fear and compassion, I stepped back, the realization washing over me that this was not a monster, but a lost soul. I felt the weight of years lift, and for the first time since I could remember, I didn't feel afraid. "You're not alone," I said softly, my voice steadier now. "You can come inside." In that moment, the air changed. The figure paused, his wide eyes narrowing in confusion. He didn't move, but I could feel the connection between us, the silent understanding of fear and loneliness. But then, as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and fled down the street, moving in that same frantic zigzag pattern, disappearing into the night. Chapter 7. The Night After. I stood by the window, my heart still racing, but now it was different. Instead of fear, I felt a sense of closure, a weight lifted. I realized that in confronting my fears, I had also confronted something in myself. I knew I wouldn't sleep well that night, but it didn't matter. I felt lighter, as if I had shared a moment of understanding with something beyond my comprehension. The following morning, I awoke to a bright sun pouring through the window, casting warm light across the room. I moved through the house, the memories more vivid than ever. I felt a sense of peace, like the lingering shadows of my past had been illuminated. And as I walked out onto the porch, I found something lying in the grass, a smooth, shiny stone, almost like a token. I picked it up, running my fingers over its surface. It felt like a reminder, a piece of the night I could keep with me. I left Decatur that day with a newfound understanding. Fears don't always fade, sometimes they transform, inviting us to look deeper within ourselves. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him again, waiting at the end of the street, but he was gone. The darkness had retreated, and with it, so had the haunting memories. Somewhere deep inside, I knew he would always be a part of me, a reflection of the fears I'd faced and the courage I'd found in the process. And while some shadows never truly disappear, They can teach us to look beyond the darkness, revealing the light that exists in the depths of our souls. But just as I began to drift off, a sound jolted me awake. It was a soft rustle from outside, barely audible but enough to send a rush of adrenaline through my veins. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was probably just the wind. But then came a more distinct noise of tapping, gentle yet insistent, coming from the window. Fear surged through me, and I knew what I had to do. I had to look. I approached the window cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. With trembling hands, I pulled back the curtain, bracing myself for what I might see. And there he was. The figure stood in the moonlight just like I remembered, hairless, tall, with those wide, unblinking eyes fixed on me. But this time, there was something different. This time, he didn't look scared. He looked curious, his head tilting slightly to one side, as if trying to understand why I was looking back at him. I felt a chill wash over me, and my mind raced. I should scream, run away, but instead I was transfixed. The years fell away, and I was once again that terrified child, standing frozen in the dark. Why, I managed to whisper, my voice barely above a breath. The figure's expression shifted, morphing from curiosity to something deeper: sadness, regret. I couldn't tell. It took a tentative step closer, and my heart threatened to explode from my chest. "What do you want?" I asked, desperation creeping into my tone. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "To be seen." The words struck me, unraveling my fears and replacing them with an inexplicable sorrow. Suddenly, I understood. The terror he had shown all those years ago mirrored my own fear of the unknown, of being lost in the shadows of life. With a mix of fear and compassion, I stepped back, the realization washing over me that this was not a monster, but a lost soul. I felt the weight of years lift, and for the first time since I could remember, I didn't feel afraid. "You're not alone," I said softly, my voice steadier now. "You can come inside." In that moment, the air changed. The figure paused, his wide eyes narrowing in confusion. He didn't move, but I could feel the connection between us, the silent understanding of fear and loneliness. But then, as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and fled down the street, moving in that same frantic zigzag pattern, disappearing into the night. Chapter 7. The Night After. I stood by the window, my heart still racing, but now it was different. Instead of fear, I felt a sense of closure, a weight lifted. I realized that in confronting my fears, I had also confronted something in myself. I knew I wouldn't sleep well that night, but it didn't matter. I felt lighter, as if I had shared a moment of understanding with something beyond my comprehension. The following morning, I awoke to a bright sun pouring through the window, casting warm light across the room. I moved through the house, the memories more vivid than ever. I felt a sense of peace, like the lingering shadows of my past had been illuminated. And as I walked out onto the porch, I found something lying in the grass, a smooth, shiny stone, almost like a token. I picked it up, running my fingers over its surface. It felt like a reminder, a piece of the night I could keep with me. I left Decatur that day with a newfound understanding. Fears don't always fade, sometimes they transform, inviting us to look deeper within ourselves. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him again, waiting at the end of the street, but he was gone. The darkness had retreated, and with it, so had the haunting memories. Somewhere deep inside, I knew he would always be a part of me, a reflection of the fears I'd faced and the courage I'd found in the process. And while some shadows never truly disappear, they can teach us to look beyond the darkness, revealing the light that exists in the depths of our souls. As we reach the end of tonight's stories on Hauntales, it's time to let your mind drift away. Listen to the sound of the rain gently falling in the background. Let each drop calm your thoughts and ease you into a peaceful sleep. There's nothing to fear now, just the soothing rhythm of the rain. Focus on your breathing, let your body relax, and allow yourself to drift deeper into rest. Sleep peacefully, and we'll meet again tomorrow night for another story. Good night.